Muntries are a tiny little, a tiny little berry. They're actually technically, I think they look like little tiny apples, actually colloquially known as the emu apple. Although they're native across a lot of parts of Victoria, into South Australia, across Kangaroo Island and up into the Adelaide Hills. And one of the few native ingredients that is actually sweet. That's one thing that we all sort of struggle in the world of native food in Australia, is actually trying to find something that actually has a little bit of sweetness. Most things are very acidic or very tart, but to find a juicy, delicious, and they're tiny. They're really only a couple of mil wide, but they're really packed full of flavour, very juniper-y like. The trick with playing around with something like Muntries, typically when it comes to something that's a little bit sweeter, is that you're always going to want to try to push yourself into the realms of being a sweet gin, and we didn't want to take it so literally that way. In fact, if you try Muntries, you'll actually notice that it does have a slight juniper spice to it, and so we really wanted to craft a gin surrounding the idea of its inherent flavour, as opposed to just looking purely at sugar sweetness. It's taken us this long because I guess we've had a bit of a plethora of native ingredients to work through. Muntries doesn't necessarily first come to mind, although it should. For most people that are thinking about native ingredients, typically they might jump to something like finger limes or quandongs or macadamias, for example, of which we have actually already made gins with. Muntries presented a little bit of a different challenge. It's not just the challenge of crafting great gin from it, it's also crafting something that people are actually going to understand and appreciate.
My very beginning, the first gin, so it was a bit nerve-wracking at first, to be honest. Yeah, I hadn't come into it yet and done it. Made any gin, had that kind of creative control over it, so there was no restrictions. Nothing sort of held me back at all. I just started throwing things together and seeing what was work. Nothing, and I think that really helped get what actually came out of the very end, because there's a few of the things in there I probably wouldn't have used if I knew what I was doing. So when I first tasted the Muntries, the first thing I thought was like a bit of a sort of a spiced Christmas pie, fruit pie sort of thing, and so that was sort of the direction I wanted to go in, but just sort of make it a little bit more interesting so it's not so Christmassy. And so I wanted to throw some like citrus in there, but avoid orange, and so did it with a little bit of lemon peel, just to get a little bit of oiliness to it. And then with the combination of pink pepper, cinnamon, myrtle and strawberry gum really sort of just threw a bit of a cool eucalypty sort of spice at it that I really enjoyed. I would say it's more spice driven, but with a nice little cut of sweetness from the addition of distilled apple spirit. Just a tiny little bit of that got thrown in at the very end, and that added a nice little sweetness and a little crispness and kind of a little bit of a green flavour to it as well, which really sort of worked out.
Muntrie Gin was cool. When you get a gin that tastes a lot like apples, because not only does that kind of real Muntrie flavour with this kind of awesome junipery spice and almost like nutmeggy quality as well come through, that's been used with a bit of apple spirit. It kind of leans you down a narrative, but for some reason my head immediately jumped to yellow chartreuse and the last word, which is, for a lot of people, may be quite strange, but that was the first thing I thought of when I tasted it for some very, very odd reason. But basically it comes down to a couple of experiences down at the awesome cocktail bar that is Maybe May. Basically what happened, the first time I ever had a last word was down there, and when I basically asked the bartender at the time, Nick Corletto, to just go make me a drink you feel like making, and he made me a last word, and I was just absolutely taken by it. Mainly probably made it for me because it's an equal parts drink and he didn't really want to think about another drink too much. But I absolutely loved it. And then another time I went down there, I think another bartender, Michael Keogh, was playing around with a competition entry, and it was a pear eau de vie and yellow chartreuse stirred kind of martini variant. And it was really, really cool, and it was one of those drinks that just stuck in my head for a long time. So when I tasted Muntrie Gin, I immediately, that kind of apple pear thing kind of melded in my head, and then went to yellow chartreuse and kind of put me in that world of somewhat of a last word riff, I guess. So that was the kind of the basis of where I went from. So once I had that framework, I was like, okay, let's have a look, read up on a few last word variants and yellow chartreuse cocktails, and kind of wanted to go, oh, I want it to be fresh, simple, no more than 4 ingredients, if that. So basically, decent dollop of Muntrie Gin, bit of yellow chartreuse, some lemon juice, and then I decided to go a bit more down the aperitif route than the kind of sweet route. So I used Suze, which is a gentian-based liqueur, to make this kind of, it's a relatively boozy aperitif style variant of a last word. It is somewhat bitter. It is quite cleansing, and that's what I liked about the drink, but you can dial it back and substitute less Suze for more, maybe you can add Luxardo or a maraschino liqueur just to kind of balance out the bitter sweetness, and that also kind of harks back to the original last word. But at the end of the day, it was a really cool little cocktail, amazing color thanks to the yellow chartreuse, just like kind of this opulent yellow, and then if you garnish it with a bit of Geraldton wax, it's just a really awesome kind of sundowner to get you started for a good evening, I guess.